I can still recall that day like it was just yesterday. The sky was a dull gray, with a light drizzle falling from above. I watched as the cold droplets slid down the window pane, and a strange unease settled in my chest. David, my husband, was preparing to welcome his old friend Marcus, who would be staying with us for a few weeks. I stood by the window, eyes fixed on the rain as it tapped gently against the glass, unable to shake the feeling that this visit was going to change everything. When I first heard that Marcus was coming, I assumed it would be just another casual visit, like all the other times we'd hosted friends and family. But something felt different this time. David, who is usually calm and composed, seemed unusually excited. He talked about Marcus constantly, speaking of him as if he were the one person in the world he trusted completely. Marcus was more than just a friend, David had told me once, his voice tinged with a hint of nostalgia, like he was remembering a time when they were closer. When Marcus finally arrived, it only took a few seconds for me to realize my intuition hadn't let me down. He was taller than I had expected, with dark eyes that seemed to bore into you with unsettling intensity. He smiled as he entered, but there was something cold about it, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. David rushed to greet him with a hug, while I stood frozen, unsure of how to feel. "Lily," David called, extending his hand. "This is Marcus, my best friend. It's great to finally meet you." I stepped forward, shaking his hand, but when his eyes locked onto mine, a strange shiver ran through me. It was like a flash of lightning in a dark room, and I couldn't place the source of that sudden sensation. Marcus's response was calm, his voice soft but steady, and his grip lingered just a bit too long. My heart started to race and I quickly looked away, trying to shake off the feeling. Over the next few days I watched the way David and Marcus interacted, as if they had never been apart. Yet, there were moments when I caught their fleeting glances, moments heavy with unspoken meaning. Marcus would often engage me in deep conversations about my art, about life, about dreams, and I enjoyed the attention. But at the same time, something about it felt off. Why did he look at me so intently, as if he was searching for something deeper? David, too, seemed more tense when the three of us were together. I noticed how his demeanor would change whenever Marcus directed too much attention my way. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Marcus began reminiscing about an old story involving David. Before he could finish, David abruptly cut him off and changed the subject. The abruptness of it left me momentarily stunned. There was clearly something going on between them that I didn't understand, and I couldn't get rid of the nagging thought. That night I lay awake, listening to David's even breathing as he slept soundly beside me. My thoughts were consumed with Marcus, his mysterious looks, his cryptic words. What was the nature of their relationship? Why was David so guarded whenever Marcus was around? The more I pondered, the stronger my unease grew. This visit wasn't just a casual reunion. It was something more. Something that was about to surface. It had been a week since Marcus moved in, and I continued to observe him, trying to figure out what it was about him that seemed to draw me in. His words were filled with inspiration and ideas that were completely unexpected. Every conversation felt like a spark, like he was awakening something inside me that had long been dormant. It was a strange sensation. I felt more alive around him, but at the same time, I could sense that something dangerous was simmering beneath the surface. One evening, when David went out to meet some colleagues, Marcus suggested we stay in and watch an old movie together. I couldn't refuse. I felt like tonight was the night I would finally understand the mystery behind his behavior. We sat on the couch, a respectable distance between us, but the tension in the room was thick. He picked a movie I had once mentioned in passing, and I was struck by how attentive he was. "I remember you said you loved old black and white films," he said with a smile, offering me a glass of wine. "Yes," I replied, trying to avoid looking into his eyes. "There's a certain magic to them. They capture the spirit even in their simplicity," I added as the film began. But my mind couldn't focus on the screen. I was far more aware of the fact that Marcus was sitting so close that I could feel his warmth. I could sense his every move, the slightest tilt of his head. At one point our hands brushed by accident and I flinched. "Sorry," I muttered, attempting a smile as I quickly withdrew my hand, but he held it firmly. "No need to apologize," he whispered, his voice low and unwavering. "Sometimes accidental touches say more than words." My heart raced. I didn't know how to respond. His grip tightened ever so slightly, and I felt a wave of heat spread through me. Suddenly, I realized I wanted him to kiss me. The air between us seemed to crackle with intensity, and when our eyes met again, I saw the same yearning reflected in his gaze. He moved closer slowly as though giving me a chance to pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned in, drawn to him as though by an invisible force. When our lips met, it was a kiss that would stay with me forever. It was soft, yet brimming with a hidden intensity, as if Marcus was trying to pour years of unspoken emotion into that one kiss. I felt his hand on my cheek, warm and gentle, and for a moment, I allowed myself to get lost in the sensation, forgetting everything else. His lips tasted sweet like wine and I was drowning in it. But suddenly I pulled back, as if I had just come to my senses. I can't. I whispered, my cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Marcus simply stared at me, his gaze piercing as if he could see into my very soul. I know, he said quietly, but sometimes we can't fight what we feel. There was no accusation in his voice, no judgment, only a deep understanding. I felt torn, caught between two opposing emotions, fear and desire. I knew deep down that what was happening was wrong, that I was betraying David, but there was a voice inside me whispering that this kiss was just the beginning of something far bigger, something I couldn't yet understand. Whether it was a blessing or a curse, I couldn't say. After that kiss, everything changed. It was as if an invisible bond had formed between Marcus and me, one that we couldn't escape. With each passing day, that bond seemed to tighten. We started avoiding each other, even though both of us knew exactly what was happening. Marcus maintained his calm and composed demeanor, but I couldn't help but notice how his gaze lingered on me more than usual, a subtle tension building between us. I could feel the inner conflict within me, a battle I wasn't sure I could win. I tried to regain control, to forget about that kiss, but it haunted me. The memory of that moment wouldn't leave me, no matter how hard I tried. I felt guilty toward David, yet I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward Marcus. There was a part of me that longed to experience that inexplicable rush of feeling again, the one that had awakened inside me when Marcus was near. It was as though something powerful had been unlocked within me, something I couldn't ignore. One evening, I walked into David's study and found him sitting at his desk, writing something. But as soon as I entered, he quickly hid the paper in a drawer. I didn't pay much attention at first, but it bothered me. Why was he hiding something from me? We'd always been open with each other, or so I thought. Is something wrong? I asked, trying to sound casual. David looked up, his eyes weary, almost troubled. No, everything's fine, he said, his voice a little more tense than usual. Just a lot of work. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had never hidden things from me before, and now it felt like some invisible wall had gone up between us. A few days later, I made another discovery. I found an old photograph in the pocket of David's jacket. It was a picture of him and Marcus, standing close together, smiling as though they shared more than just a friendship. I couldn't understand why that photograph affected me so deeply. Why had I never seen it before? And why did it make me feel this way? I started paying closer attention to the interactions between David and Marcus. I began noticing small details I hadn't before. The way David stiffened when Marcus spoke to me, how Marcus seemed to search for something in my eyes. It all felt like some kind of game, and I wasn't sure of the rules. One evening, I overheard them talking in the hallway. Their voices were muffled, but I caught bits and pieces of their conversation. You shouldn't have come, David said. His voice edged with what could have been a threat, or perhaps a warning. I had no choice, Marcus replied, his voice firm, determined. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to hold my breath. What were they talking about? Why didn't David want Marcus here? And what did Marcus mean by no choice? I had so many questions but no answers. I felt like I was caught in the middle of something, trapped between two men, each of whom was hiding something important from me. And the more I tried to make sense of it, the deeper I became entangled. The next day, Marcus approached me while we were alone in the garden. Lily, he said softly, I know you've noticed the tension between David and me. I nodded, unsure of what to say. There are things that are hard to explain, he continued, his voice serious, his eyes filled with a certain heaviness. Just know I'm not here by accident. His words sent a chill through me, a warning of some kind. What game was being played around me? I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I didn't dare. Instead, I turned away in silence, feeling my anxiety grow with each passing second. I could feel it. Something important was coming, and I needed to be prepared to face it head-on. With each new day, my doubts grew. David became more distant, pulling away from me. He avoided direct conversations, and when he looked at Marcus, his smile seemed forced, no longer genuine. Sometimes, when Marcus was near, I could feel David watching us, his eyes observing closely, trying to make sense of the invisible connection between us. The air between us felt heavy, like it could explode at any moment. One evening during dinner, I had the feeling that something was about to happen. David was quieter than usual, his gaze sharp, focused on me as though he was about to say something important. Marcus sat across from me, his face calm but thoughtful. I tried to avoid meeting his eyes, afraid that David might notice the connection between us that had formed without either of us saying a word. "You've been acting strange lately, Lily," David said suddenly, putting down his fork and crossing his arms. "Is something wrong?" His voice was too calm, too controlled. I realized then that he hadn't started this conversation by chance, especially with Marcus sitting there. "Everything's fine," I replied, my heart racing, trying to suppress the knot of fear tightening in my chest. "I'm just a little tired." "Tired?" David repeated, narrowing his eyes. "Tired from what, I wonder?" Marcus tensed, though he remained silent. I felt my hands begin to tremble, and I gripped them tightly under the table, hoping David wouldn't notice. "David, what are you trying to say?" I asked, my voice shaky despite my efforts to stay calm. "Maybe I want to ask what's going on between you and my friend," he said, his voice growing colder, sharper. He was waiting for an answer, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Marcus stood up, stepping forward as if to intervene. "David, let's discuss this in private." "No," David cut him off, his eyes never leaving me. "I want Lily to answer. What's going on between you two?" A shiver ran down my spine. I knew this moment would come, but I wasn't ready for it. "Nothing like what you're thinking," I said quietly, though my voice was uncertain, betraying me. David smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's too late for lies," he said. "Andrew saw you together at the cafe, Lily. He said you looked too close for just friends." I felt the ground beneath me start to crumble. Andrew. Of course he had seen us at the cafe that day. But I hadn't done anything wrong. Had I? Marcus stood by my side, his gaze unwavering. He knew I would have to speak the truth. "Yes," I said, my voice firming. "We were at the cafe. But it was just a meeting. Nothing more." David's smirk deepened, as if hearing something he already knew. "Just a meeting," he repeated. "Lily, I know you. You wouldn't be looking at me the way you are if that were true." Marcus suddenly stood up, his face darkening. "David, don't do this," he said, locking eyes with him. "We were just trying to spend time as friends. You know how important it is to support each other," Marcus said, his voice gentle. But David raised his hand, cutting him off. "No, Marcus," he said, his voice calm but filled with barely contained rage. "You're not here for that." I couldn't stay quiet any longer. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I fought to hold them back. "David," I whispered, my voice breaking. I don't know what's happening. I'm confused." I saw a mixture of pain and determination in his eyes. "Confused?" he repeated, his voice hardening. "Then I'll help you. I'm leaving. And tomorrow I'm filing for divorce." It felt like the world had collapsed beneath me, as though I'd been struck by a blow I couldn't avoid. I wanted to stop him, to explain that things weren't as he thought, but the words stuck in my throat. "I can't live this lie anymore, Lily." His voice cracked with despair. "You need to choose either Marcus or me. But I can't take it." I turned to Marcus, looking for something, anything to hold on to. His expression was serious, but there was a calmness in him that didn't reach his eyes. "Give her time to think," Marcus said to David, but David was already walking toward the door, his steps heavy, each one filled with purpose. I was left standing in the middle of the room, feeling the weight of everything collapsing around me. Marcus came closer, his voice soft. "Maybe we should leave. Start over." I didn't know what to say. My thoughts were racing, a blur of pain and confusion. I knew that by leaving with Marcus, I would be closing the door on my old life forever. But staying behind seemed impossible. And in that moment I realized I was standing on the edge of something new, something unknown. And there was no turning back. Marcus and I moved to another city, leaving everything behind, the life I once knew. I tried to tell myself that this was the beginning of something fresh, something necessary to finally break free from the routine, from the life that felt like a trap. But deep inside I resisted. Something was telling me this wasn't right, that this was not the step I should be taking. We settled into a small, quiet apartment in a peaceful neighborhood, far from the noise and prying eyes of our old life. In the first few days I felt a storm of emotions: anxiety, excitement, fear. Marcus was nearby, but his presence felt strange, almost unfamiliar. He started pulling away, disappearing for hours without explanation. I tried not to overthink it, convincing myself that he was dealing with this in his own way. One evening, I prepared dinner and waited for him to come home. He was hours late. When he finally arrived, his face was troubled, his expression distant, as though there was something heavy on his mind. "Marcus, where have you been?" I asked softly, my worry seeping through despite my best efforts to hide it. He looked away, his voice flat. "I had things to do." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something was wrong, I could feel it. But I was too scared to ask directly, too scared of what the truth might be, of what it might destroy. "Marcus," I said gently, "don't you want to talk? You seem like something's bothering you." He looked at me, his eyes dark and filled with pain, not joy. Then without warning he moved closer to me. "Lily," he said, his voice low, "I don't know how to say this. We both made a mistake." I could feel the ground shift beneath me. A cold shiver ran through me, and I knew what was coming, even though I didn't want to hear it. "What do you mean?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. "I thought I could forget the past. I thought we could start over. But I can't." His words hit me like a punch. I felt my heart drop and tears sprang to my eyes. "What do you mean you can't?" I asked, my voice shaking. "But you said I left everything for you." In that moment Marcus stepped forward and kissed me again. But this time the kiss was different. It was desperate, almost final, lacking the warmth and passion I had once felt. It was as if this was a goodbye, a last attempt to hold on to something that had already slipped away. I pulled back, pressing my hand to my mouth, trying to stop the flood of emotions. You don't want to be with me, do you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's shoulders slumped, and he lowered his head. "Lily," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I'm sorry. This was a mistake. All of it." The room seemed to spin as his words sank in. I stood there, completely numb, as he turned and walked toward the door. I couldn't take it anymore. "No," I cried out, rushing to grab his hand. "Don't go. We can fix this. We've just started." He gently removed my hand and looked at me with sadness that seemed to weigh him down. "Lily," he said quietly, "sometimes it's better to leave everything behind." I felt something inside me snap. I was heartbroken, furious, and completely lost. Marcus walked out, closing the door behind him, and I was left in the apartment alone with nothing but the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. I grabbed his phone from the table without really thinking about it. An overwhelming instinct to know the truth gripped me. I opened his messages and saw a conversation with another woman, filled with words of affection he had never shown me. My heart shattered. It was all clear now. I had been nothing more than a pawn in his game, a means to an end. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. Marcus had never intended to stay with me. He had used me to rid himself of his demons, and now he had moved on to someone new. I turned back toward the window, feeling the cold seep into my bones. My life was in ruins. Everything I had thought mattered was an illusion. I had lost David, I had lost Marcus, and most painfully I had lost myself. And in that moment I realized there was nothing left for me but to start over with nothing. No hopes. No illusions.
No dreams of a gran future.
It wasn't a victory, nor a defeat. It was just reality.